My name's Karen Stratoti. I am making this videotape at the request of many people. I've written a book called No More Fear. It can be bought on Amazon.com. Currently, I'm 72 years old, and at the age of 42, I was diagnosed with a disease called Myasthenia Gravis. I spent probably close to 7 to 8 months in and out of the hospital every day to try to deal with this disease. It means death of your muscles. I am a long-term care administrator and assisted living administrator, but in my past nursing, I've done burn units, ICU, CCU, emergency room. You name it, I've done it. I've always been a caregiver. When I was diagnosed with this, I was very, very angry with God. I remember going home that night, doctors trying to tell me to go in the hospital, trying to tell me that I'm going to have a crash. I'm going to wind up on a ventilator. My husband was scared to death. When we went home that night, I cried all the way home. I went into our garage where we had a computer. I looked it up, and I realized I really did have this muscle disease. So I began my conversation with God in a very angry way. I told him off, basically, in my garage, all by myself. I told him that I didn't need this, that every single thing I've done in my life has been dedicated to God. So why does he have to give me this disease? I prayed so fervently that I felt like almost like a bucket of water went off on my head. I was sweating. And I heard very gently, you need to know what it's like to be in a body that doesn't work. So then I argued again with God. What do you mean being a body that doesn't work? I take care of people that are in bodies that don't work. I've taken care of stroke victims, burn unit victims, you name it, I've done it. No, you need to personally know what it's like to be in a body that doesn't work. So when I finally gave in to the doctor and said I would be hospitalized, my muscles crashed. I wound up on a ventilator. And I was in and out of the hospital at least 5 days a week doing what they call plasmapheresis. They would take my blood out of one arm, spin it down, put it back in the other arm because my immune system was attacking my body. I got to know the staff very well. Every time I was admitted to the hospital, the girls gave me a room by myself if they could. And I would listen to beautiful music and just pray all day. I couldn't lift my head. I couldn't lift my arms. I couldn't lift my legs. It was very difficult. I remember listening to Gregorian chant practically every day, and I started to pray, and I made up this prayer saying, may every beat of my heart be a prayer to God. May every breath I take be a prayer to God. And may every blink of my eye be a prayer to God, because that's the only way that I could pray 24/7. I could beg God to take me away from this situation, but he didn't. As it turns out, after 9 months on and off in the hospital, they told me I needed the surgery. They were going to go into my thoracic chest here, like open heart surgery, and on the top of my heart was my thymus gland. And they said if they could remove my thymus gland, perhaps some of the weakness would stop, or it would at least slow the process of this disease that I have. I met a doctor who was a thoracic surgeon. I prayed very hard about who to go to with my husband. As Dr. Weber, I gave him credit. He thought it was a joke that I came in and I said, I need this surgery. I said, that's not a joke. I'm a nurse. I said, I've been told I need the surgery. And he said, how did you find me? I said, well, my husband and I have been praying about who to go to. And he said, don't tell me Jesus sent you. I said, but in essence, yes, he sent me. He sent me to get my surgery. So the surgery was approved, and turned out that Dr. Weber, in one of his past lives before he became a doctor, was a monk. And he was very excited when I told him that I wanted to pray together before surgery. I wanted the Gregorian chant on because the girls in Iowa always play the oldies but goodies. I want to have the Gregorian chant on. And I told him basically the next thing he had to do was to get rid of his ego and let Jesus operate through him. The surgery they claimed was a success. I woke up the next morning in ICU, and there was a man holding my hand. I knew it wasn't my husband's hand, so I wrote on a piece of paper, who are you? And here it turned out to be Dr. Weber. He sat with me all night. He prayed with me. The nurses couldn't believe it because he was known to be gruff and rough. It was never that way with me. But I didn't feel any different, and I was very worried about that. I felt terribly drained. I asked my regular doctor, I said, do me a favor, do a stat H&H, that's a hemoglobin hematocrit. Something's wrong. I don't feel any difference. So he finally agreed to it. He did it, and turned out my hemoglobin was a 3. And he said I obviously lost a lot of blood during surgery and that we're going to have to move me back up to ICU. So I was happy about that because being a nurse, I realized that, once I get the blood in me, I'm going to feel fine. I went into the ICU, and there was a brand new nurse that was starting. She was only there for a couple months. I could tell she was new. And she came in and introduced herself. And I said, how long have you been working here? And she said, well, at least 6 months. And I said, how long have you been a nurse? She said, well, about 6 months. I said, so you're a relatively new nurse? She said, yeah. I said, well, I've been a nurse for 25 years. Do me a favor. I said, when you get the blood, I want you to check the blood, the numbers on the blood with my name tag. Make sure I get the right blood because, Murphy's Law. I said, I'm one of the men now. I definitely want to be able to get out of the hospital. I had 3 children at home. I got my husband. So she said, oh, Mrs. Stratoti, I would never, ever give you the wrong blood. I said, all right, let's just do that together. So the first bag of blood, she did that with me and we hung it up and I felt like I had new life coming into me because my hemoglobin was so low, I didn't have enough oxygen going around in my body. The second bag of blood, apparently she brought in with 2 bags that time. I was talking with a Franciscan nun, Sister Judith Shambo, and my mother. They had prayed with me the night before surgery with Padre Pio's glove, and they put it on my chest. Asked Padre Pio to intercede for me. So she hung up the second bag of blood as my mother and Sister Judy were going out the door to get a cup of tea. My husband was there, and all of a sudden, after she left the room, I went into full anaphylactic shock. My eyes were rolling in the back of my head. I started to, have a seizure, and my jaw was locked. I couldn't talk. And I knew instinctively as a nurse that it was the wrong blood. And I was trying to pull out my IV, but all of a sudden I heard code red in my room, and I knew that I was going to be coded. And I thought to myself, this must be what it's like to die. And after I heard code red, I literally gently popped out of my body and I was floating almost like on a carpet. And I'm looking from side to side and I heard the most beautiful singing I've ever heard in my life. And I floated very gently up to this gigantic cloud. And I thought it was a cloud. It was probably about 12 feet tall. It was high. And all of a sudden I saw it starting to part. And as it was parting, I saw eyes, and I realized that it was angels, and the wings had eyes. And as it parted, I saw Jesus sitting on the throne, and I just couldn't believe it. I always used to call him my beach bum Jesus because I like to walk on the beach. I like to talk with him like he's the best friend I've ever had in my life. And he was sitting on the throne, and he came up to me, and I had my head down, and I said, Lord, forgive me. He said, for what? I said, for all the things I was supposed to do that I didn't do. And forgive me for my body failing me. Because I always prayed, body, mind, and spirit I give to you. And because my body failed me, I feel like I failed you. And he said, you haven't failed me, Karen. He said, you offered all your pain and suffering up to me. I said, I did do that. I did that. And he started to laugh, He said, come with me. He said, I have a surprise for you. So we're walking and we're talking like I was with my best friend. I knew that I was in heaven. I kept saying, this is heaven, right? He said, we're going to talk about that. And he just goes like this. And clouds part. And there's standing my father, who died at the age of 58. And he looked like he was 58, like I remembered. And then he slowly got younger as I saw him. And next to him is my father-in-law, Dominic, and he had died several years before. And the two of them had tool belts on, which made me laugh, because they both helped us with our first home. And I grabbed my father, and I kissed him, and I hugged him, and I said, oh, Daddy, I said, oh, this is heaven, right? And he said, honey, your house isn't ready yet. He said, we're trying to get it ready, but it's not ready yet. I said, Dad, I'm not going back. I said, you don't understand. I said, the kids Steve, Mom, looking at me as I'm dying. I can't do this anymore. I can't do it. I don't want to leave. And I turned around to Jesus and I said, please. I said, don't let me leave. I said, I don't want to leave. This is not the end. And he said, Karen, he said, I have another surprise for you. So we walked and we talked. I felt like I was with him for 3 full days. Time was not there. So we're walking and we're talking and he goes, there's a lot of people who want to meet you. I said, who? He said, let me show you. And he went like this again and clouds parted and there were thousands and thousands of souls jumping up and down and saying thank you to me. And I turned around to Jesus and I said, Jesus, I don't know these people. Who are these people? He said, you know that prayer you said every day? I said, which one? All I did was lay there and pray. It's all I could do. He said, every day you prayed for all the souls that were left in purgatory, that had no one left on earth to pray for them. And you asked me to give them my divine mercy. Remember that? I said, yeah. He said, these are those souls that I gave my divine mercy to. And they wanted to thank you for those prayers. I was absolutely floored. Excuse me. I started to cry. I heard through the crowd a voice that I never heard on earth. It was a young man that we took care of in one of the nursing homes. His name was Bobby. And on earth, he was born in a very deformed body. He was in an institution. And at that time, a lot of the institutions were discharging their patients out to nursing homes. And I decided that we were going to take him because I'm an administrator in nursing homes also. And my director of nursing said, oh, come on, he's going to be complete. You know, we don't need another complete patient. And I said to her, it's very rare that you get a chance to take care of someone that's never sinned in their entire life. So we're taking him. That he had a behavior problem, they told me. He refused to get dressed. He refused to get groomed. So second day, they brought him into my office. And first day, he was spitting at the girls and he was giving them a hard time. And second day, I come in and there's Bobby in my office. They said, you have to deal with him because you're the one that accepted him. I said, okay, Bobby. I said, I need your help. And he shook his head because he couldn't talk. I said, would you be willing to help me? I'm the administrator here. And he shook his head again. And I said, okay. I called my secretary, Diane. I said, Diane, I need you to make a name tag for Bobby. And his eyes got real big. And Diane, I said, make a name tag that says assistant to the administrator. I said, that's what you're going to be, Bobby. You're the assistant to me, assistant to the administrator. He shook his head back and forth. He was so excited. I said, but listen to me. I said, I'm going to need you to represent this facility properly. He shook his head. I said, so when the girls come in the morning and they're going to bathe you and groom you and dress you and shave you, comb your hair, I said, I expect all that to be done by 9 o'clock. He shook his head. I said, and then they're going to bring him out to the front lobby. And when I come pull up my car, you're to come out with your wheelchair because he could wheel himself. And I said, I'm going to give you my briefcase. And it's very important. You're going to put my briefcase right in the middle of my desk in my office. He shook his head like this. From that day on, Bobby felt like he had a job and he did it. And he was just a sweetheart. Nobody had a problem with it. And when he died, myself and 4 other nurses buried him. We sang a song, Yes, Jesus Loves Me, because that was his favorite song. So who comes crashing through this crowd of souls? But this young man, I recognized his voice. I never heard his voice on earth, but I recognized him as Bobby. And he's showing me his arms and his legs. There was no deformity, and he was like 6'2", and on earth he was like a tiny little 7th grader, you know? And he said, Karen, and he grabbed me, and he hugged me, and he's thanking me for everything he did. And he said to me, there are no deficiencies, there's no deformities in heaven. He said, look at me. And I said, oh God, Bobby, I'm so excited. And I kept saying to Jesus, this is so unbelievably cool. And he's going, yeah, it really is cool, isn't it, Karen? I said, this is heaven, right? He said, well, let's go in my garden. We need to talk. So we walk into his garden. Beautiful rose entranceway. And I smell deep smell of roses. And when I was lying flat for almost 9 months and I would pray, I would have the smell of roses. And I never knew what that was. So I asked him, I said, Jesus, what is that smell of the roses? He said, that's my precious blood. And he said, yes, you have the gift of the smell of roses. He said, I've never been far from you. I saw how you suffered. And he said, I need you to tell me what was the worst part of your suffering, your pain. And I said, having myself die before my mother and my husband. I said, I saw the pain. I knew as a nurse I was dying when they called the code. I saw the pain and the agony on their faces, and I said, it was ungodly. He said to me, Karen, I remember. I said, what? He said, I remember my mother when I was on the cross. How hard it was, he said, for me to tell my mother that this is a problem, that I was going to die. He said, I wasn't able to tell her ahead of time. And he said, she suffered so much, and I saw her suffering. And he said, that's why she's glorified in heaven. And then he talked about what it felt like to be on a ventilator. And I told him I couldn't stand it because I couldn't take a deep breath. I couldn't breathe right. And he told me, yeah, no, he said, when they stuck that spear into my side, he said, they punctured my lung. And he said, automatically. He said, I understand what you're talking about. You just can't catch your breath. You're trying to breathe. And it hurts so bad. I said, yes. He said, so, he said, you have suffered a lot of things like I suffered. So as we're walking and talking in this beautiful garden, the most beautiful garden, the most vivid colors I've ever seen in my life, I see the trees bowing in adoration as we're walking. I see animals that are crossing our path that literally stop. They looked at Jesus and they would bow to Jesus. It was unbelievable. It was beautiful. I saw a beautiful garden, a beautiful, like a fish area or a pond, I guess you call it. Then he said, could we sit by the pond? He said, I have one thing I want to ask you to do for me. And I said, I would do anything for you, Jesus. I'm yours. I'm 100% yours because I know this is heaven. I've never experienced such a beautiful place in my entire life. No pain, no suffering, nothing, nothing that was negative. And I knew instinctively I would see my husband and my children again. I didn't want to go back. And he said to me, I need you to do me a favor. I said, you tell me what you want me to do. I'll do it. He said, I need you to go back. And I said, anything but that. Do you understand? I don't want to go back. I said, I'm in this body that's not working. I said, you heard what I said to you. He said, yeah, I understand. He said, but he said, you need to write everything down that you've experienced. And I said, why? He said, because people are afraid to die, Karen. People are afraid that death is the end. Or people are afraid of me. He said, judging them. And what they don't understand is people judge themselves. He said, if they don't ask for forgiveness or they don't ever forgive, he said, they judge themselves harshly. And he said, I want you to be able to go back and I want you to be able to tell them your story so that they'll begin to understand. Death is not the end. Death is not to be feared. Death is pretty much the beginning. And just whoever you can reach, tell the story to. I've hesitated for, gosh, I was 42 and now I'm 72, 30 years of putting this on film. I didn't know how to do it, I'll be honest with you. But here I am, and I'm doing it now. My book is called No More Fear. It was published in 2017. And there's been a lot of healing that has happened with the people that have read the book. I've had positive reviews from a lot of people. I do public speaking on this. And, this is my passion at this point in time, to really get out there and talk about how my faith has been absolutely increased. And I can't wait until I go to the next level. When Jesus told me that, yeah, he said, I know this is heaven to you. He said, but Karen, he said, if you do what I ask you to do, he said, this is nothing compared to what's waiting for you when you come back. And I looked at him and I said, I can't imagine anything more beautiful than what I've experienced. And I said, could you just, show me a little peek of the next level? And he started to laugh. He said, if I show you the next peak of the next level, you'll never go back. He said, but remember, this is nothing compared to what's going to happen when you do come back. So I finally said yes, I agreed. And he pushed me basically from my head back into my body. When I opened up my eyes, the crisis team was there. And so was one of my friends, Sister Judith Shambo, who is a Franciscan nun. And I explained to her, I said, Judy, you're not going to believe what just happened to me. And she said, Karen, I've been standing here watching it. She said that they got me under control with my vitals and everything. And all of a sudden, I sat up in my bed in a lotus type position. I looked to the left, and she said I didn't blink my eye for 15 minutes straight. I did not blink. And she said the neurologist kept sticking needles and pins in me, and he's talking to my husband about the fact that there may be some brain damage. He wasn't sure what was going on because I was in this constant state. I said, what happened to me? So I explained to her what I felt and where I went. And she said to me, you were in a state of ecstasy. She said, it's a beautiful gift. She said, I've never seen anybody have this type of thing happen before me. I said, oh my God. She said, it may never happen again to you. She said, but all of us witnessed it. And she told me it was 15 minutes on earth. And I felt like I was up there 3 whole days with Jesus. I'm putting this on film because I want people to understand how passionate I am. That they need to recognize and realize that everything happens for a reason. That you were put on this earth for a purpose and for a reason. And that you should strive to do the very best that you can do with the gifts that God's given you. And you should be able to forgive yourself and forgive other people for the evil that has occurred to you. If you could do that, if you can't get some help, go to a pastor, go to a priest, go to a rabbi. I don't care what faith you are. I know that when people die, who they're going to meet is Jesus. And oh, he was beautiful. He was everything that I expected him to be. And he was very special. And he's with me now. I know that. I thank you for listening. I hope that this has some meaning to you. God bless you all. Bye.